Hey guys, tonight's journey takes us into a world where godhood was not a gift, but a relentless obligation. Imagine being born not as a child, but as a symbol. Not into a family, but into a system of expectations, rituals, and paranoia. That's what it meant to enter the world as an Egyptian pharaoh. So before we dive into this ancient pressure cooker of power and pageantry, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Only if this kind of deep dive into ancient chaos is your thing. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it fascinating who's tuning in across the world. Now, maybe lower the lights a little. Turn on a soft hum of a fan, and let's slowly drift into the life of a ruler who didn't rule. He performed. You're not born in a hospital or even in a warm chamber of comfort. You arrive surrounded by whispered prayers and anxious faces. You're barely cleaned off before priests arrive, muttering divine incantations and performing sacred rites that neither you nor anyone your age could comprehend. You're not swaddled in cloth just for warmth. It's ceremonial linen chosen for symbolism, not softness. While other infants cry and hiccup through their first few months, you're being cradled by trembling hands, afraid to hold you wrong. Because you're not a baby to them, you're already divine. Your every breath is monitored like a weather pattern. A sneeze might be read as a cosmic message. A cry could prompt a reading of the stars. Somewhere, a priest is carving your name into a limestone slab, fully convinced that the fate of Egypt hinges on your eventual smile. You're not a person, you're a prophecy. That might sound cool, but it's not a superpower. It's a job, one that started the moment you left the womb. You don't get to be a child. There are no stuffed animals or lullabies. Your toys are symbolic objects you're not allowed to touch. Instead of warm stories whispered at night, there are chants performed by elderly men whose voices echo more dread than comfort. When other children crawl, you're restrained so you don't embarrass the lineage. Your giggles are met not with joy, but concern. Because divine beings aren't supposed to giggle. That's not in the ritual texts. The people around you are not your family. They are handlers, guardians, political minders. Their job is not to love you. It's to protect the empire from your accidents. Even in your cradle, you're seen less as a child and more as a keystone holding together the sky. If you fumble, they believe the Nile might stop flowing. From the beginning, your life is structured. Every breath, every blink, every mealtime, scheduled. Your education starts absurdly early. And it's not playful learning either. You're being taught hieroglyphics, symbols that represent entire concepts, not just letters. You're not doodling. You're decoding the language of gods and kings. One wrong mark and you might accidentally command a war. You're trained in math, not for bookkeeping, but for architecture. You must learn how to calculate weight distribution for temple columns. Not because you're expected to build them, but because you'll one day stand in front of thousands and explain why they must be built that way. People will believe your words shape destiny, so you'd better get it right. Then comes religion, not belief, memorization. You're drilled on the names of gods, the order of rituals, the importance of blinking in rhythm during offerings. If you ask why you need to know how many times to wave incense, you're told it's not for you to ask, it's for the gods. And if the gods aren't pleased, guess who the people blame? You. As you grow older, the line between divine and human blurs until it disappears completely. You're now considered a living god. Not metaphorically, literally. The sun rises because you exist. The Nile floods because you will it. Never mind that you're still trying to understand your own reflection in the mirror. People bow as if you already control the cosmos. It's overwhelming, but showing doubt isn't allowed. That's heresy. Friendship, that's a joke. You don't have friends. You have political risks dressed as playmates. That boy who seems fun, his dad commands half the army. That girl you enjoy talking to, she's been promised to your cousin since she was 3. Everyone has a motive. No one is just there for you. If you laugh too loudly with one child, their rivals might interpret that as a power signal. Someone might poison your figs just to even the scales. Even your cousins aren't safe. One look in your direction too long, and an advisor whispers in your ear to watch him, because that's how you lose power. Not on a battlefield, but at lunch. So you learn to be distant, to smile with restraint, to compliment everyone equally and mean none of it. You don't trust anyone, and that's how you survive. And now that you're old enough, they bring you a scroll and a dilemma. It's time to pick a wife. But not based on love or even comfort. The choices are mostly variations of your own relatives, because royal blood must not mix with outsiders. The logic? You're divine. Your sister is divine. Therefore, a union must also be divine. Genetics? Irrelevant. Desire? Inappropriate. This is not marriage, it's statecraft. You can't protest. If you hesitate too long, priests start debating whether your hesitation is a sign from the gods. If you express disgust, they question your piety. So you smile, you nod, you prepare for the ceremony, and convince yourself that it's duty. That's what they tell you. It's for Egypt, and Egypt is more important than your discomfort, but it doesn't stop there. Now that you're married, you must produce an heir, preferably quickly. The kingdom doesn't want a pharaoh with unproven fertility. And yes, that is discussed, in the palace, in the temples, even among servants. You're still a teenager, awkward, confused, and suddenly shouldering the responsibility of cosmic continuity. And no one gives you space to figure it out. They just expect it to happen. Meanwhile, the rituals continue. Your mornings are filled with ceremonies so old no one remembers what they mean, but they still must be done exactly. You're doused in sacred water, robed in blessed linen, and painted with divine symbols. Then you spend hours reciting lines in dead languages to statues that won't respond. But if you get a word wrong, it could be interpreted as inviting chaos. Every move you make is scrutinized. Every meal is symbolic. Your sneeze is noted by astrologers. Your hiccup becomes the subject of palace gossip. If someone trips in the market, you're blamed. The crops failed. The gods are punishing your misalignment, a solar eclipse. You must have done something wrong. At night, you try to sleep. But you don't really sleep. You lie in a ceremonial bed, surrounded by guards you don't fully trust, with a knife under your pillow and your mind running through tomorrow's rituals. One wrong decision could spark revolt. And if not a revolt, then a new prophecy, which might mean your cousin suddenly becomes more divine than you. And so, from the moment you opened your eyes as a child, to now, standing in gold that itches and linen that doesn't breathe, you realize the crown you wear isn't just heavy, it's suffocating. You don't rule Egypt, you anchor it. And if you ever waver, even for a second, there are dozens of people ready to smile, bow, and take your place. The moment you're crowned, the illusion of control fades into something worse. Ceremonial servitude. You're finally Pharaoh. Time to rule, right? But first, let's glue a false beard to your face, melt some beeswax into your skin, and affix a decorative cobra to your forehead. Not because it makes you stronger, but because the symbolism must be perfect. Every adornment is chosen to tell a story. Not yours, but Egypt's. And you're the costume department's top mannequin. The crown isn't just ornamental, it's literal weight. Two symbols stacked together, the red of Lower Egypt and the white of Upper Egypt, bound into one absurdly heavy headpiece that crushes your neck and your patience. But you wear it because it says you are the unifier. Never mind that the people you're uniting haven't agreed on much for centuries. The crown must rest on your head, and it must not tilt. A crooked headdress means political instability, or worse, cosmic imbalance. And then there are the clothes. Think robes of linen starched into shapes that defy anatomy, overlaid with belts, gold plates, beaded collars, and embroidered sashes designed more for the gods than comfort. Nothing breathes, everything chafes. The sandals are decorative, which is a polite way of saying they hurt. Walking is less locomotion, more sacred shuffle. You sweat. But don't wipe your brow, that's undignified. Instead, let it drip while you pretend to embody serenity. You sit on a golden throne that creaks more than it supports, and you must sit still, because every posture, every hand movement, every gaze might be recorded in reliefs carved into stone, meant to endure for thousands of years. Smile too wide, and they say you mock the gods. Look too stern, and people whisper of curses. One cough, and some priest's scribe is already consulting the stars, but nothing matches the rituals. Your life is an endless conveyor belt of ceremonies. Morning purifications, temple visits, divine processions. You're expected to perform chants in the exact cadence passed down for 60 generations. You greet statues with rehearsed gestures. Your meals are sanctified before touching your lips. Even eating is political theater. If you show a taste for one food too often, someone interprets it as a sign. Favoring lentils. That means Horus prefers them. Barley. A priest might declare it sacrilegious because Set was once depicted holding barley. And if the harvest fails, or the rains delay, or a goat gives birth to a lopsided kid, it's your fault. You failed to please the gods. Or maybe you just blinked during the wrong ritual. When things go wrong, you don't get second chances. You get blamed. Crops rot? That's because Pharaoh lost divine favor. Locusts swarm? Clearly, the balance of Maat has shifted. A temple collapses in a remote village. They say it's a warning sign. Perhaps the gods want a new ruler, someone more pious, someone with straighter posture, someone with fewer pimples. You'd like to protest. Explain that you're human, that maybe the Nile floods because of natural cycles. But that would be heresy. You can't doubt the system. You are the system. Your dreams are analyzed by scholars who think your subconscious contains messages from the beyond. Your indigestion becomes national concern. If you yawn during a ceremony, someone fasts for a week to atone for it. Even your guards, the people sworn to protect you, might be the ones plotting your downfall. That's not paranoia, it's precedent. Assassination is just another path to succession. Your cupbearer smiles too much? Maybe he's switching the wine. The priest who always insists on your schedule could be trying to get you alone during a lunar eclipse. You trust no one. You rotate servants. You eat from different dishes. You pray the fig you just swallowed wasn't meant to end you. At night, you don't sleep peacefully. You lie down in a palace chamber that feels like a vault. Triple locked doors. A ceremonial dagger under your pillow. And someone always watching. Sometimes the same servant, sometimes not. You rotate that too, just in case they're getting ideas. And through all this, you're supposed to maintain divine composure. You're expected to smile at peasants, wave to pilgrims, offer blessings to nobles whose main interest is your eventual vacancy. You are a performance piece, an idol carved of flesh and anxiety, and the show never ends. Even festivals, which should be celebrations, are another kind of labor. You ride through crowded streets, past people throwing flowers and bread and prayers. You wave like you mean it, while your back is stiff. Your robe is clinging, and your eyes are scanning for anyone who might lunge. Every chariot ride is half parade, half public test. Can Pharaoh still stand? Can Pharaoh still smile? Is Pharaoh still favored by the gods? If you so much as stumble, rumors begin. The gods are angry, someone whispers. Pharaoh looked pale, and within a week, a new prophecy emerges from a temple in Thebes, suggesting perhaps Horus has chosen a successor. But the real game isn't on the street, it's inside the temples, because behind every ceremony is a hierarchy of priests who quietly hold the strings. They don't wear crowns, but they own the land, the grain, the taxes, the festivals. Their temples double as banks. They track omens, store grain, interpret signs, and spin public opinion like wool. They can make or break you. If they like you, your name becomes legend. If they don't, your statues mysteriously vanish. Your stories get rewritten. Your tomb plans are reassigned. All it takes is a single scroll, a divine message etched into stone, and suddenly you're no longer the chosen one. You're just another footnote. So you flatter them. You donate gold. You build temples in their name. You pretend their predictions surprise you, even when they're clearly reverse-engineered. You ask for advice you don't need, because if you lose the priests, you lose the people, and once the people turn, the generals come next. Even your own family isn't safe. Your brothers, uncles, cousins, all raised in palaces, trained in politics, each one a potential replacement. One brother has military support. Another controls trade routes. That sweet cousin with the poetic voice? Don't underestimate him. He once smiled too long during your coronation. You can't afford to ignore anyone. One wrong move, one mistaken marriage alliance, one misstep at a banquet. And it begins. Whispers, shifts in loyalty. A rival carving their own name into a stele meant for you. This is your reality. You wear gold, but it's a costume. You carry a scepter, but it's heavy with obligation. You speak like a god, but your voice shakes. And when you finally look in the mirror, under the makeup and regalia, you barely recognize the exhausted person behind the mask. This is not the dream they promised. This is the cost of being divine in a world that demands perfection and offers no forgiveness. You might think death offers release. A conclusion. A moment of silence after a life spent talking to statues and pretending you're celestial. But in ancient Egypt, death was just a career shift. You go from living god to divine corpse, and the responsibilities don't stop. If anything, they intensify. The embalming begins almost before your body cools. Priests arrive not to mourn, but to dissect your brain. They pull it out through your nose with a hooked stick, not because it's unnecessary, but because someone thousands of years ago decided that's the divine way to do it. Your organs are removed, dried, and placed into painted jars, guarded by animal-headed deities who look like they should be in a children's book, but actually serve as your cosmic TSA agents. Your skin is rubbed with oils, your body stuffed with natron and wrapped tighter than palace accounting scrolls. It's not done for respect. It's to preserve the performance. Your face must still be recognizable 3,000 years from now, when a visiting dignitary or grave robber inevitably shows up. And then, the coffins. Not one, several, each more elaborate than the last, like divine Russian nesting dolls. Gold leaf, inscriptions, protective spells. Even the wood is chosen for spiritual resonance, not for comfort. No one asks what you would have liked. This is tradition. You don't get preferences anymore. You're dead. And still, you must look regal. Then comes the tomb, a grand project you may have spent half your life building, or at least commissioning while pretending to understand architectural diagrams. Its walls are covered in texts, prayers, warnings, myths, and images of you smiting enemies you never met. It's meant to scream immortality. But what it actually says is, please rob me. Because no matter how many curses are etched into the entrance, no matter how many decoy chambers and trap doors are constructed, most tombs are looted within years, sometimes days. All that divine planning undone by some desperate man with a crowbar and a mule. And still, The real danger isn't looting, it's forgetting. If your name is erased, if your statues are toppled, if your story is rewritten, then in the eyes of the Egyptians, you never truly reach the afterlife. Your soul lingers, trapped in limbo, a cosmic bureaucracy error. It doesn't matter if you ruled wisely, built temples, or paid tribute to every god in the pantheon. All it takes is a rival with a chisel, and your eternity vanishes. That's the brutal irony. You are a god, but only as long as someone keeps telling your story. If history forgets you, you might as well have never existed. And let's be honest, your successor has every reason to speed up that forgetting. That awkward defeat in battle, rewritten as victory. That famine you tried to manage, never mentioned. Your tomb, renovated, with your name carved over. Sometimes they even repurpose your body, rewrap it, relabel it, set it in a different sarcophagus. Divine recycling. And centuries later, when some archaeologist cracks open the tomb you hoped would last forever, your desiccated remains are photographed, catalogued, and displayed under fluorescent lights. Children point at you. Tour guides mispronounce your name. Your once golden coffin is now a background prop for Instagram stories. This is not legacy. It's exhibit space, all of which makes the idea of a glorious afterlife feel a bit hollow. You spent your life avoiding poison, dodging palace intrigue, memorizing ceremonial chants, only to end up in a museum gift shop keychain collection. If your soul is watching, it's not basking in eternal light. It's wondering whether that American tourist just took a flash photo of your mummified toenail. And yet, that's not the end of your responsibilities. No, the pharaoh, even in death, is expected to work. The Book of the Dead outlines tasks, judgments, a cosmic bureaucracy to navigate. You don't get to rest. You plead your case to Osiris, heart weighed against a feather. If you were unjust, your soul is devoured. If you were balanced, you enter the field of reeds. But even then, you're not free. You're farming again. Yes, paradise involves agriculture. You're working the fields in an eternal, idealized version of Egypt, which, ironically, sounds like what you were trying to escape during your lifetime. And if you're unlucky, if your tomb is looted, your name forgotten, your memory erased, none of that afterlife happens. You're stuck. A ghost, a wandering whisper, another voice in the desert winds howling between the stones of abandoned temples. So much for divine retirement. But let's rewind for a moment. Before you reached that final tomb, before the embalming, before the politics of eternity, there was war. And pharaohs didn't just command from a safe palace. You rode into battle, because that was part of your job. To be the visible manifestation of Egyptian power. You weren't just expected to approve military campaigns. You had to lead them. Physically. On a chariot. With a bronze-tipped spear, even if you'd never killed a fly. You were expected to smite the enemies of Egypt before breakfast and pose for stone carvings by lunchtime. It wasn't optional. The myth demanded it. So you showed up, decked in ceremonial armor that clanged when you breathed. You stood at the front of formations, you waved banners, you shouted divine slogans, and in your heart, terror. You weren't trained for this. You were raised in a palace, not a barracks. But image mattered more than readiness. You had to be seen. If you won, there were festivals, songs, new temples, more inscriptions of you trampling foreign kings beneath your chariot. If you lost, well, pharaohs don't lose. If you're defeated, it's because the gods have withdrawn their favor. And that, dear divine ruler, is grounds for removal. Or worse, reinterpretation. Lose badly enough, and the priests might find a new prophecy, one that says a distant cousin, raised in the temple of Horus, is now the true chosen of the gods, and your own generals might suddenly stop returning your messages. So what do? You fight harder, you tax more, You commission monuments to rewrite the past. You have scribes describe your narrow escape as strategic genius. You show up at every festival with an even bigger smile. Because divinity is a performance, and the moment the audience stops believing, the curtain falls. You've survived battles, crushed rebellions, outlasted famines, and kept up the performance of divinity. But now your bones ache. Your advisors look younger, the palace feels colder, and no one says it out loud, but everyone can sense it. You're nearing the end. That's when the real war begins. Not out in the desert or along the Nile, but within the walls of your own palace. The halls echo not with chants, but with schemes. This is the quietest battlefield and the most dangerous, because the next pharaoh isn't chosen by gods. He's manufactured by ambition. You have sons, too many perhaps. You thought naming an heir would end the tension. It only made it worse. Every child is a faction, every wife is a player, every servant a potential spy. The boy you once cradled now whispers with generals. The cousin you once favored now hosts secret feasts. And the priests, they've already started preparing multiple versions of the succession scrolls, just in case. Your wives, yes, plural, live in gilded chambers that are anything but peaceful. They form alliances, trade secrets, and plant rumors like seeds. One might offer you tea with a smile while her handmaidens slip bribes to the palace scribes. Another might gift you sandals while quietly ensuring her son receives the better tutor. It's diplomacy wrapped in perfume and silk, and you are the prize. Sometimes you catch glimpses of their game. A quiet smirk between two concubines. A general lingering too long outside a princess's room. A priest pausing before he says your name. You understand, then, you are never the only god in the room. Everyone around you has been praying to their own ambitions. You try to secure your legacy. You build another temple, commission another statue, carve your name deeper into stone. But you know better. Stone can be chipped. Stories can be changed. All it takes is one generation to forget you were ever here, or worse, remember you wrong. Your paranoia becomes ritual. You eat only from dishes you've blessed. You change your chambers nightly. You question even your most loyal guards. But none of it helps. Because it's not death you fear. It's erasure. And the end comes quietly. One morning, you wake and feel it. Something has shifted. The priests look more confident. Your wife seems too composed. Your son bows a little too low. That night, your drink tastes different. You feel tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep solves, the kind that history confirms. You know what's coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it does, the palace moves fast. Scrolls are drafted, titles reassigned. Your sarcophagus, already prepared for years, is polished. The priests weep performatively. Your wives don mourning veils. Your heir begins practicing the divine smile. But it's not over yet, because in Egypt, death is just a new chapter. You are mummified, wrapped in symbols and secrecy. Your tomb is sealed with prayers, curses, and hopes that no one ever opens it. But of course, they will. If not tomorrow, then a century from now, or 3,000 years later, when archaeologists, cameras in hand, chip away at your eternity with tools and curiosity. Your bones become headlines. Your golden mask is displayed behind glass, surrounded by tourists whispering versions of your life you'd never recognize. Some say you were great. Others claim you were cruel. Some argue you were cursed. Most pronounce your name wrong. But the worst part? They all agree on one thing, that you were a symbol, a relic, a myth wrapped in linen. Not a man. Not the child who never had friends. Not the teenager forced to marry his sister. Not the ruler who prayed for rain. Not the aging monarch who just wanted peace. Just another exhibit in the Museum of Civilization's illusions. In the kingdom you held together with rituals and sweat. It moves on. New rulers rise. New gods are named. Your temple falls into disrepair. Your name fades from the papyrus. Your monuments crumble, and eventually someone else is crowned. They glue the beard to his chin, affix the cobra to his brow, whisper the same promises into his ear, that he is divine, that he will last forever. And so the cycle begins again. The wind howled over the snow-stained fjords, and somewhere in a dark wooden hall, a child was born into a world that had already chosen violence. No fanfare, no priests anointing his head, just the echo of steel clashing against ambition. This was Norway in the early 11th century. Fractured, smouldering, half Christian, half pagan, and wholly dangerous. The boy was named Harald. But history would not remember him as a child. They would remember him by the name he earned, Hardrada, the hard ruler. His mother, a formidable woman of noble lineage, was sister to Olaf, a warrior king obsessed with unifying Norway under one crown. Not through treaties or marriage pacts, through conquest. Harald grew up watching his half-brother try to tame a land that didn't want to be tamed. The nobles hated Olaf. The Danes plotted constantly. Old gods were whispered about even as church bells rang louder each year. And through it all, Harald learned. Not from books, from scars. By 10, he could wield a sword. By 11, he knew how to ride. And at 15, he followed his brother into war. Not in ceremony, in battle. Real battle. Mud, blood, chaos. At the infamous clash of Stiklestad, Olaf marched back from exile to reclaim his throne with a ragtag army. Harald was at his side. 15, no glorious armor, no heroic speeches. Just a boy trying not to die. The battle was a disaster. Olaf was cut down. Harald, battered and bleeding, escaped into the wild. And from that moment forward, he was never just a prince. He was a fugitive, a survivor, a man forged in retreat. But Harald didn't disappear. He reappeared east, in the land of the Rus. What to most would have been exile, to Harald was rebirth. The Kievan court, ruled by the wise and calculating Yaroslav, welcomed him not as a refugee but as a weapon. Harald signed on as a mercenary. And then he fought, everywhere. He battled raiders in the forests, nomads on the steppes, rebels behind stone walls. He didn't just survive, he excelled, he adapted, he became the blade other men feared in the dark. His reputation spread, tall, brutal, disciplined. A war machine who could flank before you saw him coming. And still, it wasn't enough. Harald looked south, toward the greatest city on earth, Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, a city of gold domes and silk secrets, a place where Vikings didn't conquer, they served. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite unit, was filled with Norsemen wielding axes in foreign tongues. Harald joined them, not as a foot soldier. As a rising storm, he fought pirates in the Aegean, crusaded in the Holy Land, suppressed revolts in Anatolia. Some say he even bathed in the Jordan River, swearing to one day return to rule, not just fight. He collected spoils, coin, silk, scars. And always, he watched. The Byzantines were cunning. Their court, a spider's web of eunuchs, generals, and poisoners. And yet Harald didn't fall. He outlasted emperors. He hoarded treasure. He learned politics from the masters. But he was never meant to be someone else's sword. So one day, he left, not quietly, not politely, with a stolen bride, if the rumors are true, and a hidden cache of Byzantine gold. He sailed north, not to visit, to rule. Norway had moved on in his absence. A young king, Magnus, already sat on the throne. He was popular, but Harald had something Magnus didn't. Years of war, coffers full of gold, and the unshakable confidence of a man who had once outlived empire. Harald didn't invade. Not exactly. He negotiated. Gold bought him warriors. Old alliances bought him momentum, and soon Magnus, perhaps seeing the writing on the stone walls of his own palace, agreed to share the throne. 2 kings, 1 crown. It lasted 2 years. Then Magnus died. Suddenly, unexpectedly. Some say illness, others say poison. Harold didn't wait for the ink to dry on the funeral rites. He seized power, solidified alliances, and declared himself sole ruler of Norway. But it wasn't enough. Because across the water sat Denmark, proud, defiant, and ruled by a rival king who refused to bend the knee. So Harold waged war, not once, not for a season, for almost 20 years, raiding, burning, hammering the Danish coast like a summer storm that never left. He never fully conquered it, but he made sure they never forgot his name. Still, for all his wrath, he ruled Norway with structure. Byzantine discipline wrapped in Viking aggression. He raised taxes, built churches, minted coins. He was no tribal warlord. He was a sovereign, a strategist, a man who had seen empires and wanted to build one of his own. And just when it seemed he might rest, he looked west, toward England, toward his final gamble. By the time Harold turned his gaze toward England, he was no longer a young man. His beard had silver in it. His back ached, but his ambition, it burned hotter than ever. He had ruled Norway. He had battered Denmark. He had walked the marble halls of Byzantium and survived. But one prize had always danced just beyond his reach: the throne of England. Now a chance appeared. King Edward the Confessor of England had died without an heir. The realm teetered, confused, vulnerable. 3 men eyed the crown: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England; William of Normandy, a bastard duke with papal backing; and Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, claiming that decades earlier a deal had been made, a promise passed through kings and corpses that the English crown would fall to the Norse. Was it legally sound? Probably not. But for Harold, it didn't have to be. All it needed was a ship, or 300. And he had them. He allied with Tostig, Harold Godwinson's exiled brother, a bitter, angry man with a grudge and insider knowledge. The deal was simple. Tostig would provide support from within England. Harold would bring the steel. The fleet sailed, massive and confident. Long ships creaked over the North Sea, their dragon heads slicing through mist and memory. Harold had done this before, 1,000 times, in 1,000 places. But this wasn't a raid. It was a conquest. He landed near York in September. The English weren't ready. Their forces were thin, scattered, unprepared. At the Battle of Fulford, Harold crushed the northern earls. The gates of England cracked open. York surrendered. The Viking Age, that fierce, storm-blown saga, seemed to rise from the ashes one last time. Harold was triumphant, victorious. He set up camp near Stamford Bridge, expected hostages, expected negotiations. What he got was vengeance, because Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king, had moved with shocking speed. In less than a week, he force-marched his army nearly 200 miles north from London. No one thought it possible. But then, that's the thing about ambition. It's contagious. On September 25th, the 2 heralds met. One born of English nobility, one forged in fire and exile. Stamford Bridge was supposed to be a place of diplomacy. Instead, it became a graveyard. Harold's men weren't ready. Many had left their armor behind, thinking the fighting was over. And then the dust rose on the horizon. English banners, swords, discipline, fury. The Vikings scrambled to form ranks. They fought like wolves, fierce, relentless. One warrior, legend says, stood alone on the Harrow Bridge and held off the English army with a giant axe. Dozens died before he was taken out from beneath, speared through the planks. That story became myth. That moment, a monument to the kind of desperation that even kings must sometimes endure. Harold fought in the front line. He didn't command from safety. He charged, sword in both hands, towering over his men like a war god born from the sagas. He cut men down, roared, bleeded, and then it happened. An arrow, straight through his throat. The king who had survived empires, defied assassins, and outlasted generations, was felled by a silent arc of wood and iron. No prophecy, no farewell, just blood and silence. Reinforcements arrived too late. The field was soaked with Norse blood. Of the hundreds of ships that had come from Norway, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The message was clear. The Viking dream was dead. Harold Hardrada died on a grassy field by a quiet English river, but his fall thundered through history. The arrow that struck his throat pierced more than flesh. It shattered the last true Viking dream. For centuries, Norse longships had carved the world's coasts into maps of ambition. After Stamford Bridge, those sails folded. The age of raids, of glory, hungry kings from the north. It ended with a single, fatal breath. But the consequences didn't stop with him. Barely had the Norwegians limped back to their ships, 24 vessels where 300 had once proudly landed, when word reached Harold Godwinson. The English king, victorious, exhausted, and barely breathing himself, received news that made his blood run cold. A second invasion had begun. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed in the south, backed by the Pope, armed with cavalry, discipline, and an army of claims. Had Harold not invaded from the north, Harold Godwinson might have had weeks, maybe months, to prepare. Instead, his army was shattered, drained from the brutal clash at Stamford Bridge. There was no time to recover. 3 weeks after defeating one invader, Harold had to march south to face another. At Hastings, he fell, struck down, not by exhaustion, not by treachery, but by the cold arithmetic of timing. Had Hardrada never come, Harold might have repelled William, or at least met him on equal ground. But Harold's gamble, though it failed, cracked open England's defences just wide enough for the Normans to slip through. So, in a strange twist of fate, the man who failed to take the English crown helped deliver it to someone else. And with that, everything changed. The Normans reshaped England's laws, language, architecture. Castles rose, land was parcelled out, the Saxon aristocracy fell. French became the tongue of courts and contracts, 1,000 small ripples, each leading back to that muddy field near York where Harold Hardrada bled into the soil. Back in Norway, the news of his death arrived like a cold wind through stone halls. The great conqueror, the Byzantine veteran, the Viking thunderhead, was gone. His son Olaf took the throne, but Olaf wasn't his father. Where Harold was fire, Olaf was ash. Calm, measured, deliberate. He brokered peace, encouraged trade, consolidated power without swinging a sword. And just like that, the flame of Viking aggression flickered into embers. The long ships didn't vanish, but they changed. They became cargo vessels, not war machines. Traders replaced raiders. The gods of old were replaced by churches of stone. Sagas gave way to scripture, and kings stopped dreaming of conquest and began managing economies. There were no more berserkers charging into foreign monasteries, no more kings swearing blood oaths under eclipsed moons, no more flaming longships sent into the dark with swords and slain slaves. Instead, there were merchants, priests, diplomats. The Viking world had turned inward, but Harold's name did not fade. Even centuries later it echoed, not in royal decrees, but in sagas, in stories told by candlelight. He was remembered not just as a king, but as a force of nature, the man who had sailed farther, fought harder, and dared more than any of his peers. The last true Viking, not a myth, not a god, a man who would not stop until the world remembered him, even if the price was his life. And remembered he was. After the field of Stamford Bridge fell silent and the last dragon-prowed ships sailed into the mist, something shifted across Europe. Not loudly, not instantly, but definitively. The Viking Age was over, not with a bang of thunder or a great final raid, but with the fall of one man, a king, a warrior, a poet. Harald Hardrada, the last titan of a world built on axe and ambition. But though the long ships ceased their war songs, Harald's shadow remained. In Norway, he was not buried in shame. He was remembered in verse, in carved stone, in whispered stories beside hearths. Not as a failure, but as the last to dare, the last to swing a sword at the world and demand it remember his name. And it did. His story was woven into sagas, those epic poems that bound myth and man into something greater. In Iceland, he became a heroic ghost. In England, a cautionary tale. In Byzantium, a rumor, the northern warrior who once guarded emperors and vanished with their gold. To the Christian chroniclers, he was ambition incarnate. To the skalds, he was a legend in human skin. His deeds echoed through history, not just for their scale, but for their defiance. While kings counted coins and forged treaties, Harald rode into battle with a dream between his teeth. But history is cruel to those who lose. The Normans rewrote the narrative. English scribes painted Harald as a foreign threat. His role in the unraveling of Anglo-Saxon England was tucked beneath layers of other names, other claims. William took the credit. Harold Godwinson got the martyrdom. Harald Hardrada, he became a footnote, yet not forever.
Historians later returned to the bones, to the poetry, to the strange, winding journey that began in a snow-covered village and ended on foreign soil, with a sword in hand and a crown just out of reach. They began to understand him not as a marauder but as the embodiment of a fading world. A world where kings led from the front, where honor meant battle, where gold was won, not inherited. Harold's name, Hardrada, hard ruler, wasn't an insult. It was a badge, a scar made into a title. He was not kind, he was not fair, but he was unforgettable. And in a time where memory was survival, that was all that mattered. Even his afterlife defied erasure. Modern scholars debate his tactics, question his claims, analyze his legacy. But they agree on one thing: he mattered, more than most. His life touched three empires: the Norse, the Byzantine, and the Anglo-Saxon. His sword crossed the Mediterranean. His verses still survive. His bones, perhaps, still rest beneath stone. But more than all that, Harold stands as a symbol, not of conquest, not of failure, but of motion. He was the last Viking to dream the old dreams, to chase glory across oceans, to die not in bed but in battle, screaming, bleeding, unbent. And when the longships stopped sailing, when the sagas dimmed, and the world moved on to crowns of gold and courts of marble, one name still lingered like the echo of a war horn fading across the fjords: Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king. Harald Hardrada was dead. Harold Godwinson was dead. But England was not at peace. In the space of just 3 weeks, 2 kings had fallen, 2 invasions had bled the land, and a third force, the one waiting patiently across the channel, now moved in like a tide. William of Normandy didn't win because he was the strongest. He won because he was patient, because others had bled before him, because when the crown finally fell to the ground, he was the one standing still enough to catch it. After Hastings, there was no coronation of joy. No songs, just silence, shock, grief wrapped in confusion. But William moved fast. Castles were built. Lands were divided. Saxon nobles were stripped of power. In less than a decade, the entire architecture of English society would be rewritten in stone, in law, in blood. But something else changed too. The Viking dream died. Not because it was defeated, because it was absorbed. The Normans, after all, were not strangers to the old gods. Their ancestors had once been Norse themselves. men of the fjords who had settled in northern France and traded their axes for estates. William's blood still carried echoes of the Sea Kings. But his crown was forged not in saga but in strategy. He was not a Viking king. He was what came after. As Norman England rose, what remained of Harald Hardrada faded into myth. In Norway, his son Olaf took the throne and did what Harald never could: he made peace. He stopped chasing foreign crowns. He settled disputes with ink, not iron. And for the first time in generations, Norway entered a kind of stillness. No longships headed west. No raids in the name of forgotten gods. Just the quiet hum of survival. But Harald never truly vanished. He lived on in sagas, in stories told by skalds who still remembered the way he rode into battle, spear gleaming, voice like thunder. Children grew up with his name on their tongues, not as king, as legend. There is power in that. Because long after the empire's fall and the maps change, it's the stories that survive. And Harold's story, the boy at Stiklestad, the exile in Ruse, the bodyguard in Byzantium, the king who reached for England and died trying, was too grand to forget. He became the last fire before the dark, and that made him eternal. The longships no longer prowled the coasts, and the roar of northern war cries had faded into silence, but the world could still feel the echo. Even after the last Viking king fell on an English field, even after the sails were furled for the final time, their presence did not disappear. It settled instead into the bones of Europe, quieter, colder, but far from forgotten. The monasteries that once trembled at the sight of dragon-prowed ships were rebuilt in stone, but behind every prayer whispered within their walls lingered the memory of fire. On the coasts and in the valleys, the names of towns still bore the marks of Norse tongues, and the blood of raiders ran quietly through the veins of kings and peasants alike. And in the north, the stories began. They didn't call them history. They called them sagas, half myth, half memory, whispered beside hearths and carved into brittle vellum by men who had seen the old gods vanish. These stories did not celebrate peace. They celebrated struggle. A man could die, fail, lose everything, and still be remembered, so long as he died on his feet with his sword in hand and his will unbroken. Harald Hardrada, though defeated, became more than a king in those stories. He became a storm that refused to pass. He became the last fire before the frost. But while the age of raids and plunder had ended, the Norse people did not vanish. They simply changed shape. The children of warriors became merchants, explorers, kings, and poets. Their weapons were sheathed, but their ambition remained sharp. In Denmark and Norway, thrones that once belonged to warlords now hosted kings who wore crosses and signed treaties. In Sweden, trade routes bloomed across the Baltic and eastward into the rivers of Ruse. Iceland, isolated yet fiercely proud, preserved the sagas of old, writing down the lives of those who once dared to fight gods, seas, and fate itself. These were no longer Viking kingdoms. They were nations quieter, steadier, but bearing the same defiant spark in their marrow. Elsewhere, the Viking legacy lived on in more surprising places. In Normandy, a land once claimed by Norsemen, William the Conqueror's dynasty ruled England with iron and French law, but under it all was the blood of raiders. In Russia, the Rurikid dynasty, descended from Swedish warriors who had once paddled down the Volga and Dnieper, ruled vast territories under Slavic names but Norse lineage. Even in distant Byzantium, the emperor's guards still bore names that sounded like thunder in the fjords. Some of them had carved runes into the marble of Hagia Sophia itself, leaving behind not prayers, but signatures, a final act of presence in the heart of an empire. And so, the Viking Age ended not with an explosion but with an exhale. It did not vanish, it evolved. The Norse became a current beneath the surface of Europe, influencing language, law, and lineage. Their gods faded, but their values remained: the reverence for courage, for loyalty, for the stories of the dead. And in the North, they never forgot the man who had carried that torch to its last battlefield. Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king, was not remembered for what he conquered, but for how he refused to stop reaching. Even as the world changed around him, even as old dreams crumbled into dust, he kept chasing something greater. He lost everything, and for that they turned him into legend. The swords were sheathed, the ships docked, and the stories of men like Harold faded from the shores they once conquered. But Europe did not rest. It merely changed the shape of its ambition. Where once strength had been measured in steel and oaths, now it was measured in land, alliances, and bloodlines. And in this quieter violence, a new stage of history emerged, the age of courts and crusades, of whispered love and open betrayal, of lords and ladies bound not just by law, but by longing. It was here that power slipped out of armor and into silk. Castles rose like jagged teeth across the countryside. They were not built for comfort, but for control. Stone towers loomed over muddy villages, and within their cold walls, nobility lived like caged predators, pacing between feasts and councils, always calculating. Kings no longer led charges, they led negotiations. Queens were not mere decorations. They were players, sometimes more ruthless than their husbands. But the most dangerous weapon in these halls wasn't a sword or a crown. It was love, or rather the idea of it. In the courts of Aquitaine, Champagne, and Aragon, poets began to weave a new language, one that wrapped violence in roses, that cloaked desire in devotion. It was not love as peasants knew it. It was distant, impossible, a performance between nobles who could never be together and often never truly wanted to be. A married lady, admired from afar by a knight, a sonnet left in her window, a glance across a hall that meant nothing and yet meant everything. They called it courtly love, but it was not innocent. It was power disguised as passion, because behind every poem was a message, behind every dance was a negotiation, behind every flirtation was a threat or a promise. A knight who loved his lord's wife might also be the man most loyal in battle. A lady who inspired half the court's attention might sway more policy than a bishop. And when things went too far, when real affairs broke through the metaphor, castles burned, heirs vanished, and wars began. This was a world where rules were written and broken by the same hands. Honor mattered, but only the kind that could be seen. Chivalry became performance. Tournaments replaced real war, though men still died in them. Knights donned colors chosen by women they could never touch and spilled blood in their name, not out of love but out of spectacle. Behind the glittering pageantry, families plotted assassinations. Marriages were arranged like military campaigns, and the church watched it all with a frown and a ledger. Because even holiness had its price. The papacy, growing fat in Rome, preached against lust and vanity, but accepted donations from kings who needed forgiveness on short notice. One coin could absolve 1,000 sins, if given in the right hand. But even as priests condemned the songs of the troubadours, those songs spread faster than sermons. Across Europe, the language of yearning became the language of ambition. Love, that most personal of feelings, became political. And in the midst of this strange, gilded theater, a new kind of conflict brewed. One that would carry knights not across dance floors but across continents, because a new frontier had opened, one not of passion but of fire, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, a city half imagined and wholly contested. The church did not just demand hearts, it demanded swords. And soon, the same knights who once pledged their lives to unreachable ladies would pledge them again, this time to Christ. But war, whether in bedchambers or in deserts, always leaves blood on the floor. The age of chivalry did not begin with love. It began with fire lit not by kings but by a pope. In 1095, the words echoed from Clermont like thunder rolling down a mountain, Deus vult, God wills it, 3 syllables that would stain half the known world red. The Holy Land, Jerusalem, a city sacred to 3 religions and ruled by none in peace, became the target of every ambitious lord, every restless knight, every second son denied land by birth. The church promised heaven to anyone willing to draw blood for it. And men, desperate for glory, redemption, or a chance to escape the mud of their lives, answered in waves. They called them crusaders. They wore crosses sewn to their tunics. Some believed, others simply saw opportunity, land, gold, forgiveness. It didn't matter. The army that moved east was a storm, not trained, not unified, but burning with the conviction that God had chosen them. And when that kind of fire takes root, it doesn't just burn enemies. It consumes everything. They marched across Europe, pillaging Christian towns before they even saw a Muslim one. They starved. They froze. They fought among themselves. But still, somehow, they arrived. And what happened next was not divine justice. It was slaughter. When Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, they killed without distinction man, woman, child, Christian, Muslim, Jew. Blood flooded the streets so deep that chroniclers, exaggerating or not, claimed it reached their horses' knees. And yet in the West they were heroes, saints, the men who reclaimed the tomb of Christ. They returned not as butchers but as holy warriors. The church exalted them. Songs were written. Banners were raised, and so more came. The Crusades did not end in a year. They did not end in a generation. They lasted centuries, a cycle of conquest and reconquest, betrayal and alliance. Kings grew old in the deserts of the Levant. Children were sent to war and never returned. Orders like the Templars and Hospitallers rose from the chaos, wielding faith like a sword and finance like a dagger. For some, Jerusalem was a spiritual beacon. For others, it was just the richest piece on the chessboard. But beneath the gold, the rot spread. Because for all its glory, the crusading world was hollow. Soldiers returned home to find their land sold, their names forgotten. Lords who died abroad left kingdoms in chaos. And the church, bloated with power, began to fracture under its own weight. Crusading, once a sacred duty, became a habit. By the time the Fourth Crusade arrived, they weren't even fighting Muslims anymore. They sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, looted its churches, tore down its monuments, and left it bleeding, all in the name of Christ. And still, the songs continued. The language of chivalry, of holy war, of divine love, it all blurred. A knight might leave his beloved with a kiss and return a decade later with blood still crusted in his beard. A lord might build a chapel from the bones of the conquered. The lines between salvation and damnation wore thin. In the courts back home, troubadours still sang of roses, of longing, of noble suffering. But by then, everyone knew. The world wasn't saved by purity. It was ruled by power, wrapped in silk and blessed from pulpits dripping with coin. Faith had become a sword, and Europe, once the land of oaths and raiders, had become a crucible of kings and corpses.